Hello class, today we're going to be discussing shape, perspective, and space as part of our unit online. We're going to start off with some terminology. Shapes are enclosed areas of space that are created by adjacent lines or other adjacent shapes. Like lines, shapes can be implied and do not need to be enclosed to suggest their presence. When lines are accurately drawn in perspective or able to create the illusion of space. Perspective in drawing is a technique that we use to render three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Space refers to the distance within, between, and around elements in the composition. Space can be open or closed, shallow or deep, two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Two-dimensional space is illusionary, it's flat, and we can't travel into it. And three-dimensional space is the real physical space that we exist in and the objects that we render exist in. Scale and proportion. Scale refers to the size of an object in relation to other objects, whereas proportion refers to the interrelationships that exist within objects itself, themselves. For instance, an object's height relative to its width. Scale and proportion can be manipulated to help create the illusion of space whenever we're working in perspective. So in terms of scale, large objects appear to be closer to us and small objects appear to be further away from us. Whenever we're dealing with proportion in perspective, we can stretch or compress objects in spaces in order to make the effects of perspective feel more exaggerated and create what we call forced perspective or a forced space. Whenever we're talking about perspective, we have these key terms that come up a lot. Of those terms, we have horizon line, true horizon line, vanishing lines, and vanishing points. The horizon line is traditionally defined as the line that is created by the meeting of the sky and the land. So if we imagine kind of like a desertscape, a barren desertscape where there's no hills or anything, the line where the sky and land meet is the traditional definition of the horizon line. The true horizon line, however, is determined by your eye level and is subject to change depending on your elevation. So two people can be in the same room and they can both be drawing the same object, but the horizon line that the person sitting down has and the person standing up has are totally different, right? And they're going to see different relationships and different information coming off of that object depending on where their true horizon line is. Vanishing lines are extended parallel lines that seem to get closer together the further away they get from us and eventually converge on a single focal point. This focal point is our vanishing point, which is the point on the horizon line where vanishing lines the edges of an object appear to diminish and converge. In these two compositions, I want to kind of break down how we see the terms that we just defined in real space and how we can kind of track that. So the first thing that we're going to try to do here is identify where the horizon line is in each of these photos. For me, it helps to think about the horizon line as where the height of the camera was whenever these photos were taken, or where the artist was whenever they documented this photo. So the easiest way to find the horizon line in a composition is to look at the place where diagonal lines kind of seem to flatten out, or where we can't see the top or bottoms of an object, right? So on the piece on the left, we can see the undersides of these shelves, which tells us that these objects here are going to be above our horizon line. And then as we move down the sides of this image, we can kind of start to see the top sides of this shelf, and definitely we see the top sides of this object are these bags of rice down here, right? So that tells us that our horizon line is going to exist somewhere between the area where we can see the tops of objects and where we can see the bottoms of objects. And for me, that line is right about in here, kind of across her shoulder. On the piece on the right, if we're using the same logic, if I'm looking at the lumber back here in the background, I can see the bottom of these shelves again. And then the further down I look, I can start to kind of see the top of these stacks of lumber. So the place where I can't see the top or the bottom of an object is kind of right around here. That's more or less where my horizon line is. So I went ahead and plotted those lines out here. The next step is going to be to map out where our vanishing lines are. And again, with vanishing lines, these are lines that are going to be appearing to converge on a singular point, right? So if we're looking at the piece on the left here, the vanishing lines are much more evident. We can just kind of follow the edges of these shelves and then see where these lines kind of lead us. And it looks like they kind of lead us here. The same thing with the lines coming off of the shelves on the right. They're all kind of pulling to this central figure here. They're pulling to this little girl, and just a little bit off center, right? Whereas the piece on the right, the lines coming off of these shelves do kind of seem to converge almost directly center here on this this girl's dress. So let's go ahead and map those lines up. So here we have our vanishing lines kind of pulling us in to the center of the composition. So what we see here is that we can use vanishing lines to create not only the illusion of perspective, but also to help kind of direct the viewer's eye to important areas of a composition. The next step, now that we have our vanishing lines mapped out, is to establish where our vanishing point is. What is the point of conversion in each of these compositions? And for the piece on the left, like I said, it's just a little bit off center and kind of hitting here on her shoulder, her left shoulder. The piece on the right, it is kind of dead center. But in both instances, we can see how the artist used one point perspective as a framing element to help kind of center focus on these two central figures and create kind of like a narrative of importance on these people. So kind of a different approach to perspective as a tool for photography. Next, we're going to be discussing 1 and 2 point perspective in a little bit more in-depth terms. In 1 point perspective, we have a single vanishing point where all of our vanishing lines recede. In 1 point perspective, we also are always approaching an object from its frontmost face. They're basically always facing us straight on. The following slide will show us several boxes in 1 point perspective, and will show us what happens to objects as they kind of vary in location in relation to our horizon line and our vanishing point. So as we can see on this slide, the same square will provide different observational information based on where it exists in relationship to the horizon line and the vanishing point. So a square that is drawn on the horizon line and near center to the vanishing point will produce essentially just a flat square. If we move that same square above the horizon line, we'll be able to see its bottom. If we move it below the horizon line, we can see its top. But if it's centered with the vanishing point, we can't really see the left or the right sides of our cube. So in order to see the right side of the cube, we need to move our square to the left side of our vanishing point. In order to see the left side of our cube, we want to move our square to the right side of the vanishing point. And you can see how moving that square to the extremes of the page will open up more and more visual information that we can observe. So our observations are that as objects approach the horizon line, how much of an object we see changes. When an object is above the horizon line, we cannot see its top. When it's below the horizon line, we cannot see its bottom. The same is true for the vanishing point. When an object sits to the left of the vanishing point, we cannot see its left side. And when an object sits to the right of the vanishing point, we cannot see its right side. 2 point perspective. 2 point perspective differs from 1 point perspective in that we have 2 vanishing points instead of 1. Where in 1 point perspective compositions are set up from a frontal view, objects drawn in the 2 point perspective are usually rendered from a 3/4 view where we are approached by the corner of an object. For the following images, I want you to ask yourself the following questions. Is the drawing in 1 or 2 point perspective? And is the object above or below the horizon line in the composition? So here we have some more kind of breakdowns again, some refreshers. In 1 point perspective, the image is front facing. In 2 point perspective, the major object in the image is in a 3/4 view, or a corner is facing us. And another kind of quick recap on placement. If an object is above the horizon line, we can see its bottom. If it's below the horizon line, we can see its top. If an object is extremely near or on top of the horizon line, we cannot see its top or its bottom. So in this slide, we have an installation by artist Dan Flavin, which has it's got a red corridor and a yellow corridor that are divided by these bright pink metal bars. So this image is in 1 point perspective. The square shape created by the metal bars in the middle of the hallway is facing us straight on. The vanishing lines created by the top and bottom edges of the wall lead us to a single vanishing point on the back wall. So these are our vanishing lines here. If we carry them all the way to our horizon line, we can see them all hitting on this single vanishing point here. Here our square shape appears to be sitting directly on the middle of the horizon line and centered on the vanishing point as well. So because it is centered on the vanishing point and it's on the horizon line, we can see the front face, but we really can't see the top of the square or the bottom of the square in this particular image. In this composition, we have a young man riding a horse, kind of like in an empty street, and then behind him there's a pretty large warehouse. In a composition like this, where we don't have a geometric shape as our kind of immediate focus, we want to look around the composition for clues that kind of cue us into whether this is a 1-point perspective composition or a 2-point perspective composition. In this case, the major image that we would look to is that warehouse. So in looking at the warehouse, we can tell that it is in 2-point perspective. We can tell this by looking at the building and seeing that we're not approached by the front face of the building, but rather its leading edge. This is also what we refer to as a 3/4 view, right? So the left and right faces of the building also recede to their respective vanishing points. So we can see these angles pitch in 2 different directions. These leading lines or these vanishing lines would carry me to a vanishing point off screen on the left, and these vanishing lines would carry me to a vanishing point onto the right of the screen. You can see over here kind of traced off on the shape. As far as our building, it's sitting mostly above the horizon line and slightly below it. Because of this, we cannot see the top or the bottom. Now in this composition, it is a very kind of complex image, so it's best to kind of take your time with it, just to kind of absorb the visual information. Here we do have a couple of major elements to kind of cue us into what's happening. This was kind of a trick image. The image has both 1-point and 2-point perspective, along with different horizon lines for each of the major objects that I've identified. The major example of 1-point perspective here is the large blue hedge on the left, which is sitting below the horizon line and to the left of the vanishing point. We can tell its placement based on the way the object appears. We can see its top, and then we can also see its right face, which tells us that our horizon line is going to be above the object and that our vanishing point is going to be somewhere to the right of our object, since we can see its right face. The major example of 2-point perspective in this image are the 2 buildings that are at the top of the hill. As you can see, the building's leading edge is closest to us, and its left and right faces recede to 2 different vanishing points. So as we can see here, if we follow the left edge of this building to the left side here, we can kind of see this angle receding to a vanishing point on the left, and then the angle of the right face pulls us to a vanishing point on the right hand side. As mentioned in the previous slide, despite the hedge and the building being so close to one another, they actually have different horizon lines. As you can see in the model above, our object is above the horizon line, which allows us to see its bottom and not its top. So I chose this image basically to reference the fact that in real life, whenever we're drawing from observation, we are going to have objects that are in 1-point perspective as well as 2-point perspective. So get used to seeing these things existing in the same place. And don't be so attached to kind of the rules and regulations of 1-point and 2-point perspective. We want to kind of be able to see the relationships that exist in this space and be able to kind of call them out so that we know how to apply the rules, but won't necessarily need to plot horizon lines or vanishing points when it comes to drawing from observation. Our demonstration videos will be posted tomorrow. Make sure you check back and check those out so that we know how to approach our exercise on 1-point perspective as well as our exercise on 2-point perspective. For each of these exercises, I am wanting you to draw 10 objects in 1-point as well as 10 objects in 2-point perspective. So make sure you watch those demonstration videos and work along as we're demonstrating so that you can get that knocked out. It seemed to help some people last week for me to post student examples, so I'll be doing that again this week. So make sure that you check out this lecture as well as the student example lecture so you can see what the exercises look like once they're completed.